Yes, welcome everyone to Season 3 of The Matrix, Conversations and Transformations, a seminar series from the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice in Los Angeles. I'm Professor Mary Christianakis, and I'm joined by my co-organizers of The Matrix, Professors Caroline Heldman and Malik Moazzam Dolat, as well as the organizer of the Matrix Ballroom series, CTSJ Professor Claire Crawford. Today, we are so excited to be joined by a panel of experts in a variety of areas to discuss the crisis of Xinjiang, where the region's majority Muslim Uyghurs are facing persecution by the Chinese government. Before Professor Moazzam Dolat introduces us to the panel, a quick overview of The Matrix and what's still coming up in our third season. The Matrix focuses on pressing current events, and our goal is to connect our community and innovative experts, scholars, artists, and the most effective activists in the areas of critical theory and social justice. Next Thursday, we will have our final episode of the powerful Ballroom series. Our guest will be Sydney Ballou, who is the writer, producer, performer, and archivist who conducts oral histories of New York City's ballroom scene. He currently works as co-EP writer on HBO Max's Ballroom Competition reality series, Legendary, and his writing have been featured in the New York Times, Vice, and Them. The final 2 episodes of our third season will be on April 15th and April 22nd. Please note that we are using the webinar format. That means that you can submit your questions at any time via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And without further ado, Professor Malik Moazzam Dolat.
Hi, everybody. So this event is being co-sponsored generously by the Department of Diplomacy and World Affairs, the Young Initiative on Global Political Economy, and the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life at Occidental College. So let me introduce our panelists. Dr. Timothy Grose is an associate professor of China Studies at the Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology. His research on expressions of Uyghur ethno-national identities and public performances of Islamic piety has been published in the China Journal, the Journal of Contemporary China, Ethnic and Racial Studies, China File, Dissent, and Foreign Policy. Timothy's commentary on ethnic policy in Xinjiang has appeared in Al-Jazeera, The Atlantic, CNN, The Diplomat, The Economist, The Guardian, Vox, and many others. His first book on boarding schools for Uyghur students, Negotiating Inseparability, was published by Hong Kong University Press in 2019 and was awarded the 2020 Central Eurasian Studies Society Book Prize in Social Sciences. We're also joined by Salam Al-Mariyati, who is president and co-founder of the Muslim Public Affairs Council, a national organization. Salam is nationally recognized for his commitment to improving the public understanding of Islam and policies impacting American Muslims. He oversees MPAC's groundbreaking civic engagement work, public policy, and advocacy. He's an expert on Islam in the West, Muslim reform movements, human rights, democracy, national security, and Middle East politics. He's spoken at the White House, Capitol Hill, and represented the United States at international human rights and religious freedom conferences. We're also joined by 2 members of the Department of Diplomacy and World Affairs, Professor Lan Chu, who's the chair of OXI's Diplomacy and World Affairs Department and is affiliated faculty in Latina, and Latin American Studies. Chu's research and teaching interests focus on identity and ideology, the political role of religious institutions, namely the Catholic Church's influence on international relations, faith diplomacy, and interreligious dialogue. Professor Anthony Chase is also a member of OXI's DWA department. His research and teaching interests focus on human rights, the work of international organizations, and the politics of the Middle East and the broader Muslim world. Very lucky to be joined by them. It's a wonderful panel. So we're going to start with a short presentation by Professor Grose, and then we'll follow up with conversations with our panel. Okay, so Professor Grose, please take it away.
Great. Well, let me go ahead and share my screen. And as I do so, I would like to thank everyone for this opportunity. And, you know, I've been talking about this crisis publicly now since 2018. And one part of this experience that is a little bit intimidating is the amount of trust that people have in me to talk about this. And I don't take this responsibility lightly. And so and haven't been able to go to the region since 2017 for multiple reasons, political and having now 2-year-old twins. I wanted to maintain this trust. And so I think the best way of doing that is using Chinese Communist Party sources at their own words. So throughout this presentation, the vast majority, in fact, I think it's all of my information is coming directly from Chinese Communist Party sources or Chinese officials who are blogging about their experiences in Uyghur and Kazakh communities. So I want to begin with some indisputable facts, and one is the mass incarcerations of Uyghurs, and here we see satellite imagery, but again, I want to rely more on Chinese Communist Party sources, and I believe there was a link to one of the announcements to the Xinjiang documentation project, and so what I've been doing on my sabbatical is searching through Chinese social media, collecting and archiving documentation, essentially from either county level governments or from the sent down Chinese officials that have recorded detentions, mass detentions. And oftentimes they provide numbers, and I alone have tabulated tens of thousands of incarceration. So this is an indisputable fact. And many of them, and these are all from these types of this part of the project we call blogging Fanghuiju. This is the program where you have officials live, work, and study alongside Uyghur families. And here we have pictures inside some of these so-called re-education centers. So again, this is indisputable. There's mass incarcerations going on. Do we know exactly how many? I don't, and I never put an estimate on it. There are some villages in the region that have incarceration rates that are significantly high, almost startlingly high, over 10%, 20%. And beyond what I've collected through Chinese Communist Party sources, we know that a number of high-profile Uyghurs, especially in academia, and colleagues of mine have been detained, and many have been sentenced with quite harsh punishments of 10 years or so for quote-unquote crimes against the state. And so, again, this just adds to this growing amount, the indisputable amount of evidence of mass incarceration. And we also know from these government sources I've collected that because of the mass incarceration, we have large numbers of children separated from families. You'll see that on the top, my top left-hand corner, we see a school that was specifically built for children whose parents are of the so-called two types of people. That means incarcerated or detained. The particulars, or the image on the far right corner, right above the title of the slide, The Separation of Parents and Children. That particular school has 5,500 students, and almost 1,800 of them have, it's not explicit, but at least one parent who who's either been incarcerated, who's either been detained or re-educated, right? So again, these are coming from state sources. We can't deny them. And when they go publicly on state media and say that these sorts of mass incarcerations aren't happening, they're flat out lying. But I think there's this misunderstanding that outside of mass incarceration, and there's several types of facilities of mass incarceration, that somehow Uyghur and Kazakh lives are normal. And that's indeed not the case. In fact, there's really multiple levels of surveillance that occur in Uyghur and Kazakh communities, especially in rural areas, especially since rural areas don't have the type of infrastructure to build up the high-tech surveillance that you see in large urban spaces in the region like Urumqi, and then in the city center of places like Kashgar and Holkan. So what officials have done is they've created a program that's akin to quartering, and essentially the party has assigned government workers, many of whom are Han, with Uyghur families. And depending on, and we'll get into this in a moment, depending on what category the family is labeled, whether it be a safe, normal, or unsafe, the amount of surveillance that the family is subjected to changes. Up until very recently, I was able to live stream Uyghur language news broadcasts from Xinjiang, but as I started to post screenshots of the news, it's been no longer accessible, at least from me, and I don't bother to use a VPN or anything. But one of these broadcasts, and again, this is going back to this so-called Fanghuiju, the program of assigning family members to government officials to Uyghur families. So according to this May 30th, 2008 broadcast, the sent down workers, sometimes called sent down youth, sometimes called big brothers and big sisters, made 24 million house visits. And so again, oftentimes that means one family will have multiple visits. They conducted 33 million interviews. Look at what these interviews entail. And again, these are more like interrogations. And they organized over 8 million ethnic unity activities. So this is a human surveillance. And what they're trying to find out are the basic information that could maybe provide details or clues to the state of whether or not they pose a quote unquote risk, whether or not they're quote unquote extremists. But really what at the core of what they're trying to find out are there religious sensibilities in the family. And so here we see one of the forms that these work teams possess. Now, most of them are on an app, and I tried to sign up for the app to see what was in there, but I didn't have a Chinese mobile number anymore, so I wasn't able to do that. But as we can see through this, through my labeling here, a lot of it is just very basic information: the name, the size of household. Size of household, of course, is also important because of families that exceeded birth limits, and we see a very direct tie to families that exceed birth limits and detentions, but also the ideas of religious beliefs. Does this family express religious sensibilities? Are they pious? Are there any clerics in the family? And also importantly, are they part of the targeted population? And targeted populations are special segments of not just Uyghurs. It's actually a category used throughout China, but has even greater importance in Xinjiang because of mass incarcerations. And so essentially, if you have a direct relative that's been incarcerated, sent to re-education, the entire family becomes targeted population. This could preclude them from some entitlement programs. And through these many of the sent down workers and keep diaries, they share their experiences. Here's an entry of one of the house inspections, and the individual was named Ali Aishan. He was 36 years old, resident of village group 9. There's his household information. There are 3 people. He earned 6,000 renminbi from an orchard and supplementary income from taxis. And so looking at this information, he would probably be labeled as a safe, right? There's nothing about his profile that suggests that he has cultivated any religious piety, therefore making him, quote unquote, a threat to state sovereignty. Now, to be sure, the Chinese Constitution extends the freedom of religious belief to all Chinese citizens. And that's true. You can't dispute that. But if we look at the Constitution, both in its translated form and through the original, what isn't guaranteed is the freedom of religious expression. And that's where we see the state intrude into the lives of Uyghurs and Kazakhs, because they in many ways very arbitrarily change what types of expressions are permissible and even legal, especially when it comes to Islam. And so throughout my travels to the region, I began traveling regularly to Xinjiang in 2006, and like I said, my most recent visit in 2017. There were signs outside of every religious building that posted the so-called illegal religious activities. Some of them are really specific, but others, like using religion to organize activities that can hinder social order, so arbitrary that they can be interpreted basically on the spot by officials. And often this one is used to convict, quote unquote, extremists of wrongdoing. So let's go through the 5 pillars of faith fairly quickly and to see how the party has attempted to suffocate expressions of religiosity amongst Uyghurs and Kazakhs. Oftentimes, when you look at state media and apologists of the Chinese Communist Party, you'll see them count this number that Xinjiang has 24,000 mosques, which it's probably a little bit, maybe significantly fewer now, because there is evidence of destructions and conversions of mosques into other buildings. But what this number doesn't tell you, which is more important than the number of buildings, especially if these buildings are vacant, are who can actually perform the namaz or salat, the ritualized prayer of Islam. And so again, we need to turn to Chinese Communist Party sources to tell us who can actually pray in mosques. During my travels, you would often see these signs, and this is a picture I took in Wuhan, that say quite explicitly, minors, college students, and anyone employed by the government and their immediate relatives are forbidden from praying. And the Chinese state is the largest employer of Uyghurs in China. Now, if you're not connected to the state at all, you may be allowed to go into the mosque, but you also know that they're being monitored by high-tech surveillance. And in urban areas, and this one is in Hotan, you have these central brain centers where the mosques of the mosques of the city are being monitored by officials. In rural areas, you have these sent down workers take notes of who's going in and out of the mosques, and there's certain things that they need to look for. They're also listening to the sermons during Jummah or the Friday communal prayer. And of course, we know that mosques are being destroyed. And again, I'm not relying on satellite imagery here, but looking at work team notes, and they talk about quote unquote adjusted number of mosques. And in one village, the number of mosques was adjusted, and we can read this as destroyed from 10 to 4 because of quote unquote concentrated residential living. Okay, now let's move on to another pillar of faith, and that would be of Ramadan. So again, we know if you're a government worker, you can't express any sort of Islamic piety, but the prohibitions against fasting extend even further to even guardians of students. So guardians of students in Hoja in northwest Xinjiang pledge not to fast during Ramadan. They also pledge that 3 meals will be served to their children every day during Ramadan. Even retired state workers have had to pledge not to engage in any religious activities, and if so, they would be guilty of being a quote-unquote two-faced person. In other words, a member of the party because of the association with their work, yet still cultivating religious sensibilities. There are also state-organized meals where they bring in villagers, and they'll often have a type of either like a big banquet or they'll introduce them to fast food. And of course, these are all occur during the day during Ramadan. And teachers and other state workers often have to make yearly pledges to not fast, not to engage in any other religious activity. So this is a very crude flow chart, but basically what you see here is that very few people are permitted, very few segments of the population are permitted to fast. And regardless if you're permitted or not, you're at least discouraged to fast during weekly meetings. And so right now in Xinjiang, it began before COVID and it paused during COVID. But now again, they're weekly Monday flag raising ceremonies, and they are preceded by lectures. Right? And I know that my 15 minutes is probably coming up soon, so we'll go even quicker. It's a little bit harder to to make any sort of conclusions about the number of Uyghur Hajj pilgrims, because the government doesn't provide breakdowns by ethnic minorities. And so the number of Hajj pilgrims in China has grown significantly since the opening of China after Mao's death in 1976, and then the economic opening under Deng Xiaoping. Again, we don't know exactly how many are Uyghurs because the government doesn't provide that data. But what we do know is that the minimum requirements for Uyghurs to apply for the Hajj, you have to go through state channels, is much stricter than other regions of China. The minimum age is a lot higher, and of course, the confiscation of passports a few years ago, it was virtually impossible, actually legally impossible for Uyghurs to make the Hajj. And passports are being returned, but again, there's also a list of blacklisted countries and countries with majority Muslim populations are often found on that blacklist. That could lead you lead you to detention. And we're kind of now narrowing in, focusing in on the individual. We have we looked at three of the five pillars of faith in Islam. We didn't look at shahada or zakat, and now we're looking at individual expressions of religiosity. And since 2013 and 14, there are prohibitions on certain forms of pious dress, essentially the niqab, and that covers the face, long beards, and also certain styles of hijab. Headscarves, as far as I know, were never completely banned, but many places they were officials discouraged the donning of any type of head cover. Uyghur names are being changed, and it is now illegal to have quote unquote overtly religious names. And of course, like many Muslim communities, it's common for Uyghurs to pick names that have religious significance to them, using either beautiful names of Allah, the names of prophets, or names that have these kind of sacred connotations. We don't need to go into the naming ceremony, but there are now restrictions on the naming ceremony, and who can actually perform the naming ceremony, where it can be performed, and who's allowed to have a cleric there. Basically, if you're an official, you can no longer have a cleric to preside over the naming ceremony. But I think what's more troubling is that now many names are essentially illegal for Uyghurs. And so this, the photo here is from a state published book that I bought in the region in 2015 that lists common Uyghur names. And of course, many of these names have religious roots to them and religious significance. So Hajim, Imam, Muhammad, the names of the Prophet's wives. What we see happening in newspapers, this comes from the Xinjiang Daily online. And what I've censored here are their ID numbers, because they place their ID numbers with the name changes. We see name change announcements. So one example, my son's former name was Qadruddin Mahmud. Again, Mahmud being a variant, Turkic variant of Muhammad. I changed his name to Qadruddin Muhammad Yusuf, and then we lived X, Y, and Z. I was named Abu Bakr, of course, one of the rightly godly caliphs. From this day forward, my name is Asghar Qadir. My daughter's original name was Aisha, but I changed the name to Arzul. Weddings also are facing more restrictions, especially the nikah component, which is the religious component of the wedding. All families are encouraged to move the nikah outside the home and into these what are called rural service centers, and no longer can government officials nor their children hold a nikah. So their services have to be 100% secular. And so, quickly concluding, what does this all mean? It provides this very, very strong evidence, almost irrefutable evidence, that the government is trying to recreate a Uyghur identity, and a Uyghur identity that's void of its Islamic and Central Asian roots. And so there's a deleted social media post by a Uyghur county official who says, if we aren't Muslim, we are atheists. Why must we invite clerics to engage in religious rituals, at name-giving ceremonies, circumcisions, weddings, and funerals? Why do you wish to eat halal? And then he adds, Uyghurs are Uyghur. They aren't Muslim. We must make this concept clear. And I think here we see the Chinese Communist Party now trying to realize what they've believed and hoped all along, that Uyghurs are actually part of this Chinese nation, the so-called Zhonghua Minzu, that they've already been, as part of this family, that they're no longer Uyghur, and meaning that their identities should no longer be rooted in Central Asian and Islamic norms. And now we see a process which they're trying to uproot these sensibilities and replace them with norms more common to the Chinese mainstream.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. That was outstanding. And maybe what I can do is just first direct a very brief question to you, which you can answer just, in a capsule form. I recommend everyone check out Professor Grose's Twitter account, where he provides lots of access to this information. But could you please maybe briefly tell us if you think there's a problem around information dissemination around this crisis? Is there a disinformation problem? And what advice do you have for our audience about how to parse the information coming from official and journalistic sources? Answer any one of those. How about that?
Yeah, most certainly. There's misinformation and disinformation. I think that one of the causes of misinformation is lack of access to the region, and this I'm talking about kind of the more of the mainstream media outlets. And when they are given access to the region, they're often have government minders to them, and they don't actually able to speak with people outside the purview of the state. And many of the reporters, although maybe you're conversant in Chinese, may not know Uyghur and unlikely know Uyghur. And so you can actually speak with Uyghurs in their own language about their experience. So I think there's misinformation. There's also disinformation, and this disinformation is coming from CCP media and of course fringe groups on the so-called left, and they deny any atrocity going on, and oftentimes these individuals have no experience at all in the region. They can't read Chinese sources, and they set up straw men to try to defend the Chinese policies in the region. I just recently stomached a 12-minute video where someone claimed that because there are 12 or 24,000 mosques in the region, that of course he was hoping his listeners would assume that there's no religious persecution going on in the region. So I think there should be a basic litmus test for people who want to get information, and part of that should be, have people been to the region? Are people conversant in the languages of the region? And what sort of ties do they have with the Chinese Communist Party?
Thank you so much. So Salam, MPAC began advocating around this issue and asking for an international response more than a decade ago, probably longer than that. So just for some background and around the debates around the Uyghur crisis, how do you understand the discussion about militant Islam in the Central Asian region and its effect and impact in the Uyghur areas? I don't know if you want to say something about that.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And thank you, Malik, for organizing us. And thank you, Professor Grose, for that excellent presentation. I learned a lot, and I hope that we can amplify your findings and your analyses. So really appreciate that. And I think, Malik, what you're referring to, or at least my interpretation of it is, there is this underpinning that we find in all of the crises involving Muslims and Muslim minorities in particular, whether we're talking about the Uyghurs and other Muslims in China, or now what's happening in India and Russia and other countries as well. And that there's this notion that we have to be fighting militant Islam. And what does that mean? We've never really paused to analyze what the repercussions of that, especially repercussions in terms of our own values of freedom, of pluralism, of human rights and human dignity. Because the counterterrorism policy of the United States, and in the Middle East, it's of the United States and the government of Israel, those counterterrorism policy have begun this spiral of attacks against Muslims in Central Asia, in China, in South Asia, and so on and so forth. So there's a war against anyone who is deemed militant, even though we tolerate militant Jews and militant Christians and militant Hindus and militant Buddhists who themselves might be committing atrocities. But when it comes to one Muslim who acts violently, then there's a cascade of events that lead to what's happening to the Uyghurs. There is first, number one, the first phase is we will now deal with technicalities. If you do not have a building permit, we're going to close down your cultural center, your mosque, and we will monitor and we will have surveillance because you are not abiding by the law. You're not signing to this allegiance to the state as opposed to what your beliefs are in terms of your religion. It's not done for any other religion. It's only done to these Muslims in particular. And by the way, when I'm talking about these Muslims, the first culprit, the first hypocrite is the set of Muslim majority countries who have said nothing about the plight and the persecution of the Uyghur Muslims. Every Muslim majority country has buckled, has remained silent because they're doing the same thing to their Muslim population, to their Muslim communities by sending Muslim leaders in jails, by calling it militant Islam, by persecuting people so that they can maintain control. The second level then is this cultural cleansing, what we find in re-education centers that China is calling, that because you haven't figured out your religion because it's militant now, we will figure it out for you and we will cleanse you from that religious identity. And even though you see the situation happening in China, to some extent, it's beginning to happen in France, when France has said, we will now take over the mosques and only our government-sponsored imams will be the ones who will teach you the right form of your of what the French government considers the right form of your religion. So that's what I mean by even we in the West are going against our own values of separation of church and state and of pluralism and of secularism. In that case, obviously, in France, it's a form of secular fundamentalism, but that's another matter altogether. Then the third level is an outright physical war, the killing and decimation of populations. And that's basically what we're leading to. Now, for us Muslims, we're dealing with so many atrocities, as I mentioned. The Serbs did that to the Bosnians. What's happening now in Kashmir, the Palestinians, what has happened to the Chechens by the Russian governments, and so on and so forth. Each week we are hearing of a new atrocity. We cannot keep up with it. While former Secretary of State Pompeo declared what's happening to the Uyghurs as genocide, so far it is lip service. We have not really seen any economic or real political teeth to putting a check on what's happening to the Uyghurs there. So we are not faring well, but we are more aware of it than we were 20, even 30 years ago.
Excellent, thank you. Professor Chu, I'm going to turn to you here and ask you a broad question. So how do you understand the Chinese government's approach to Islam in Xinjiang, in this autonomous region, and more broadly in Chinese-controlled territories? Is it in keeping, as you understand it, with government approach to religion in its territories? I can ask a series of questions here. How is it related to the government's approach to religion in other autonomous regions like Tibet? How do you see it wrapped up with economic and other political interests? And I was just wondering if you would want to address that broader question.
I think I'll try to answer them all at once. So what I'll do is, I think it is in keeping with how the Chinese state has approached any religion in the autonomous areas, because it's all, from my perspective, it's all strategic, right? And what they really try to focus on is how, I think it has less to do with the religion, but much more to do with, and the religious practices per se, but much more to do with how can we make them nationalistic? How can we unify them? And I think the moment any religion makes an overture to, yes, we will abide by some sort of nationalist sentiment, they become much more forgiving in that sense. But I think especially in the autonomous regions, the approach to religion is much more aggressive because of the strategic matter of economics and geopolitical. With regard to religion in general, within China, it changes because they're already within, and it's less of, it's a less pressing matter. In the case of, Chinese Catholics, I mean, they're less than 1% of the population. They're able to sort of negotiate with the Holy See and the Vatican to try to get a political strategic position that way, and because of the Catholic Church's policy of subsidiarity, it allows the Catholic churches to have much more expressions of nationalism. So that's why they're a little more forgiving there. But I would imagine if they didn't have that policy, it wouldn't be the case. And just to close up, I think it's very similar to what Salam had just stated in terms of the failure of the Muslim majority states not responding. The difference with, let's say, for the Catholic community, it's a transnational religion in the sense of the hierarchical structure really puts in place for these external organizations, the external Catholic Church, to speak up for the church, for the Catholics within China, and that's not happening, unfortunately, for the Muslim community. So that's how it really depends on, I think, how nationalistic and how you're willing to play the game with the communist state.
Thank you very much. So one last question in this first round, and then we'll get into let the panel address each other and raise questions. Professor Chase, I will be providing some resources to our students and to our community around what some activism has been. And I know that you had linked to scholars, a scholars group advocating for some redress for the Uyghurs. What are the mechanisms that you think ultimately are available to the international community, to the UN, to address this crisis? And to what extent is this, as Salam has mentioned, addressing it made more difficult by the discourse and practice of the US and the West and the global war on terror? You can address one, none, or all of those questions.
Thanks for giving me those options, Malik. Can I ignore all of them? Would that be a possibility as well? Thank you. First, I just want to start by thanking you for putting on this really excellent panel and bringing attention to this really important but not discussed enough issue. And also just extend my thanks to Professor Grose. That was really excellent, and you do excellent work. So I really wanted to note that and start from there. I guess there's two ways to answer your question, Malik. One, in terms of what the mechanisms are, they're pretty straightforward. The question is really how to make them work. But the mechanisms are from Security Council denunciations from a UN perspective to UN special rapporteurs who paid a lot of attention to various issues around the world, around the globe, to the work of agencies, arms, the UN on the ground, UNDP, UN Development Program, et cetera. So those are the sort of formal mechanisms within the UN system for addressing an issue such as this. I don't think it's going to be a surprise to anybody here that given the geopolitical weight of China, they're able to block those on every level. The same way if there's mass violations of human rights by a country like the United States or other Security Council members, it's very difficult to mobilize the UN mechanisms in a way that is critical and effective. So really the question is less what the mechanisms are, but how to address that. And I guess I would turn that into maybe something of a question for both of the panelists, Salam and Timothy. It seems to me that the issue is one of social movements. Why is there such a lack of pressure globally in terms of this enormous level of human rights violations. I don't believe in sort of comparing levels of human rights violations. One is more important than the other, but this is clearly a major issue, which is really receiving very little resonance in populations around the world. So it gives me the lack of socializations at the grassroots within the Muslim world. That's a problematic in terms of not bringing pressure to bear on governments and on UN mechanisms to take more effective action. And the second comment I would make really is more about the Muslim world. That relates to what Salam was quite aptly mentioning, the real silence of major governments in the Muslim world. And I would add Organization of Islamic Cooperation, 57 countries, international organization in the world, again, largely silent, acquiescent. How is it that one can build up pressure for a more effective response to not just Islamophobia in the abstract, but a real harsh mobilization of Islamophobia in this specific context, and obviously not forgetting the context as well, when you have governments of the region so actively blocking that sort of mobilization. So I think you would need to have governments as well as the social movement mobilization in order to bring those UN mechanisms into effect, to answer your question. And I guess that raises my questions to Professor Grose and Dr. Al-Mariati.
So would either of you like to respond to that?
Let Professor.
That's a great question. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just saying you should go first.
Oh, I should go first. It's a great question, and it's one that frustrates me, especially thinking about the lack of mobilization amongst civil society. And unfortunately, I don't have a great answer for it. And thinking about the current political climate in the U.S. and in the era of Trump and his supporters, I have to think that some of it has to do with this, with kind of global Islamophobia, the fear and distrust of the quote unquote other, and just misunderstandings of Islam more general. And again, that these currents are not just in the US, but more broadly in North America and in Europe. And unfortunately, we have a group that has these very intimate ties to Islam in Central Asia. And I think for some people, that raises red flags because of their apprehensions towards the quote unquote Islamic world. And I think there's also, especially amongst young people like all of you, I work with university students. The place where young people are getting their news isn't exactly where we're communicating our messages about the Uyghur crisis. I'm already behind the times in terms of social media, and it's hard for my students. It's hard to convince my students to read articles, like our academic articles and print articles and news articles. And oftentimes they seek out YouTube or Instagram for their news. And unfortunately, academics don't have a presence there. But these kind of web celebrities do, and it's many times these web celebrities who are disseminating disinformation.
Yeah, and let me add to that, and I agree 100% with Professor Grose on those points. From my standpoint, as an American Muslim who deals with public policy and a lot of these national security issues, we have to start with our own counterterrorism policy. Our counterterrorism policy is, as I was alluding to earlier, the underpinning of it is to fight Islamic militancy. That is where we're spending most of our money, even with the white supremacist extremist threat, even after January 6th. Although that's changing, the bulk of our national security state is designed to fight militant Islam. That has to change. It has to change because, number one, I mean, as it relates to the Uyghurs, I think it's obvious. This is exactly the same playbook that the Chinese government is implementing. They said, if you guys are fighting Al-Qaeda and ISIS, well, we're fighting our version of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The Israeli government is saying exactly the same. If you're doing this with detaining people in Guantanamo, we have to do the same thing with any Palestinian militants because of Hamas and Hezbollah and so on and so forth. So we have to rethink our whole counterterrorism approach, and that is obviously a major undertaking. You can't just wish it away, and you have to create alternatives. You have to develop a narrative. As American Muslims, we have to create our own narrative of what it means to deal with militancy, because there is extremism. But as I said earlier, Jewish extremists and Hindu militants and Buddhist militants there's a double standard. I'm sorry. Am I going too long? There's a double standard with the way we're dealing with those militants versus the way we're dealing with Muslim militants. We deal with them to say, well, let the political arena play out and the moderates will outvote the extremists. We can't have that for Muslims. We cannot allow a political, even though when you look at most Muslim majority countries, religious extremists do about 3 to 5% in any election. But somehow we have raised their profile and turned it into an existential threat to the West. And not to diminish what happened on 9/11, but that cannot speak for the 1.5 billion Muslims of the world, and we're suffering from collective guilt over what 19 hijackers did, right? So there has to be a whole reform of our counterterrorism policy to begin with. As far as Muslim majority countries, there has to be an approach to deal with them more towards a human rights perspective, a human rights evaluation of every relationship we have with Saudi Arabia, with any future Iranian regime, because right now there's talk about bringing the monarchy back that is being supported by American political groups here in the United States, which is amazing to me. But in any case, in dealing with the problem of Iran and the need for democracy there has to be that human rights component in our policy. It's not there, obviously. It's all about geopolitics, even though there's a lot of rhetoric that we are committed to our values. We are not. If there's one thing that people don't see is our own commitment to our own values of human rights and democracy there. Sorry, I went.
Well, I was just going to say, let me throw this out there, which is, to what extent does the withdrawal over the past 4 years of US involvement and engagement in the region and China's growing influence and investment and development in the region driving this silence? Is that a possibility? Does anyone on the panel want to take that up?
I think the short answer is yes, because now with economic concerns that many countries are dealing with China as a superpower, and I think obviously that is another factor in terms of their silence.
Okay, so we have some questions from the audience and the panelists. Any other things you want to say, please do. There was a discussion here by several people about ethnic Kazakh Muslims, and I don't know if Professor Grose or Salam, you wanted to say something about that. So the question is, the Amnesty International doesn't seem to be responding to what's going on there. There doesn't seem to be any publicity around that issue. I know that Professor Grose, you had mentioned it. Do you want to say just something very briefly about that and let us know?
Yeah, certainly Kazakhs have not been immune to state violence in Xinjiang. Because their population is significantly smaller than Uyghurs, I think that they've received less media attention, though some of the most outspoken survivor testimony has been from Kazakhs, because we've seen Kazakhs have more success of leaving China, because many of the first round of detainees either had Kazakh visas or they had Kazakh citizenship, and there was pressure mounting on the Kazakh side to get their citizens and people that had other connections with Kazakhstan out. And so again, so a lot of the really kind of firsthand survivor testimony is coming from Kazakhs. Though because the majority of, especially the sent home worker campaigns are concentrated in southern Xinjiang, which is predominantly Uyghur. There's just more information coming from these sources, and not so much in the north, where at least historically speaking, in recent history, the north and eastern regions of Xinjiang were always considered to be more stable than southern Xinjiang. But certainly, yeah, they're being incarcerated. They're subjected to the same types of surveillance and religious persecution. In fact, I posted something I found a couple weeks ago where I think it was 2018, 2017, Ramadan overlapped with the Dragon Boat Festival. And so there was a Kazakh village and the sent down workers made them eat zongza, which were these rice wrapped in leaves. Right, so this during Ramadan. So they're by no means have escaped this sort of persecution.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we haven't talked about a number of issues that have come up. They've been in the press and some of the resources that we'll be providing to our students in our community. But there is sort of this interesting problem around what is it that the autonomous region provides about 20% of the world's cotton for textiles, and that it appears that there's forced labor producing that cotton. And so there's a couple of things about that. Does anyone have any ideas, Professor Chase, Professor Chu, about how our community, our students can use that issue as pressure to both raise awareness about it and put pressure on corporations to maybe win some kind of movement or concessions around this?
I think it's possible. I think there was also a question somewhere in the chat that might have talked about how China's been using technology to increase oppression and exploitation. I think the reverse can be used, right, to sort of try to challenge that, to make it more aware of what is going on, so that information can travel much more quickly. There was a recent article that said that the Chinese Communist Party has actually now recruited a number of their own celebrities for their cause, to actually say, well, if you don't buy cotton from us, then we're going to withdraw all of our performances. So it's interesting how they are now making it a much more nationalistic agenda. Now, not just the state talking about it, but they're getting their own celebrities and their pop stars to be on the side of the state. And those celebrities are actually saying on their social media that how unfair it is, that we're being accused of that China is being accused of a number of things, but we stand behind the state. So it just shows you how much, the control, the culturally, that their reach that they have.
And I can pop up. I see a couple questions that are related to the points that Professor Chu was just making and some of the earlier comments, and specifically from Anna VB and from Emily Livingstone. And it seems to me that I would really just go back to what Dr. Al-Mariyati said. It seems to me that he was really spot on, that part of a critique is, a human rights-based critique is to be willing to apply the same standards across the board. So the US needs to be subject to criticism in terms of our own both internal human rights violations as well as our support for violations in different parts of the world. That should not, however, be used to excuse violations within the Muslim world, or in this case, in terms of China. And so, in terms of the question from Anna here, we didn't interview then, so why should we now? I think it's a matter of having a consistent intellectual position that has integrity, that applies the same standards to which governments have helped elaborate under the pressure of social movements around the world, and to which all governments should be subject to similar types of criticisms. So if one can get beyond the sort of, well, they did it, so why should this country be criticized for it, to those countries should be criticized. Israel should be criticized for its systemic violations, in terms of Palestinians. The United States needs to be criticized consistently for the structural discriminations that African Americans have faced in this country for decades, for centuries, and I can keep on listing the examples. I don't think I need to. But the point is to kind of move beyond the sort of rhetoric of governments from the US to China of pointing the finger elsewhere as an excuse for our own internal violations, and instead apply those same standards across the board.
And if I can add, I think it was really unfortunate for the Uyghur lobby. They were desperate to get support for, beginning in 2018 when we began to learn more about mass incarcerations. And amongst politicians at the time, they didn't want to take up the issue. And then when politicians finally decided to take up the issue, it was far right-leaning Congress people, many of whom, literally have blood on their hands from wars in Muslim-majority countries. And I think denialists and apologists of the CCP and their atrocities in the region point their fingers to those politicians who are trying to speak out both sides of their mouth. Now, of course, this isn't the Uyghurs' fault. They were just looking for support from anyone who was going to give it to them. Unfortunately, again, for them, it was the U.S. far right, many of whom are so-called China hawks, and also some of the architects of really brutal violence in Muslim majority countries.
Can I add 2 points to that real quick? Number one, the left has to start thinking about religious freedom. We cannot leave religious freedom as an issue only from the right. It really undermines the whole purpose of a pluralism of religious coexistence if it is only a right of center issue, for the very reasons that Professor Grose mentioned, that people start wagging the finger at us to call it hypocrisy. Number two, we need a two-prong approach in terms of social movements, in terms of pressuring Washington and the United Nations. We should not give up on the United Nations. The United Nations is still an important international body that deals with these issues. If there's will, there's political will by the United States, by Americans themselves. Even though China is on the Human Rights Council, we have a lot of problems. According to Ken Roth of Human Rights Watch, the UN Human Rights Council is still has voted by and large consistently with human rights. So we can outvote those human rights violators through the UN Human Rights Council. So we need to deal with the UN as well as the United States.
Thank you. Professor Christianakis, did you want to ask a question?
I just, I can't help but think about the parallels with children being separated from their families here in the United States, and the same thing happening in China. And I was wondering what you, this specifically for Professor Grose, can you talk a little bit about your work with the schools and what this means for children and what this means for children's rights specifically?
Yeah, well, we don't know exactly the long-term consequences, the psychological consequences of these separations. Of course, rightly so. This issues of separations at the border in the United States are gaining attention. Maybe not as much attention as they deserve, but at least we have movements trying to put a stop to this. But again, in terms of the psychological trauma it must create, I think should be the immediate concern. But then there's also the long-term consequences of this separation. And again, so here we have, in these examples, we have arbitrary incarcerations of parents because of having religious sensibilities. If both parents are detained, they're often sent to orphanages or dormitories or boarding schools. And this is in addition to the national level boarding school program, which I did my PhD research on, which is voluntary, and yearly enrollment stands at 10,000 young people from Xinjiang, who vast majority of whom are minorities. And the long-term consequences is that you have several years, if you're small children because of incarceration, you're separated from your parents. Even if you're in high school, you have 4 years of separation. You lose that generational transmission of knowledge, this cultural knowledge. and you miss out on opportunities to learn how to express yourself as Uyghur from the ways your community express themselves as Uyghur or as Kazakh. And I think that this is going to have a very devastating long-term impact on the next generation, next two generations of Uyghurs and Kazakhs, if we don't see reunions amongst families, and we don't see a loosening of restrictions on the ways Uyghurness and Kazakhness be expressed.
Thank you so much for that and wonderful question. So thank you so much to the panel. We're out of time. The audience has been so patient. Can't thank you enough for your excellent contributions. And what we'll do is we will send out to our community your Twitter handles and the resources that we gathered from your work, and they can reach out to you that way. But thank you again for your time and for your expertise. All right, we'll stop it now. Take care, everybody. Thank you. We'll be back on Thursday with another episode of The Matrix.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.